I looked with great anticipation to going to New York and just thought it was the most beautiful of cities and so great. And so I got there and I had the feeling, at last I have reached New York.
New York City in 1933, the biggest city in America, more than 7 million people. New York was the financial center for the nation, but Americans were losing confidence in capitalism. Banks were failing, the system was shutting down, and taking with it the dreams and savings of ordinary people. New York was a city of modern skyscrapers, but the streets below, designed for the horse and carriage, were now clogged with 800,000 cars a day. Ferries carried commuters where modern bridges were needed. Life on Fifth Avenue proclaimed the city's wealth. But 1/3 of New Yorkers lived in tenements. Immigrants from the old world crowded into the new.
It was ghetto, pure and simple. Not too different from the ghettos of European cities where these people had come from, but new to America. New York City just didn't have enough homes for the poorer elements of the people.
Also moving into the city were black people from the South and Caribbean, making Harlem the largest black community in the United States. In these Harlem tenements and in the immigrant neighborhoods, the Depression hit particularly hard.
There was a kind of sense that everybody's having a hard time. We didn't have a feeling that some people were making it and some were suffering. Everybody had to compete with everybody for the scarce things that there were.
Pushing the federal government to aid the urban poor was New York Congressman Fiorello LaGuardia. Half Italian, half Jewish, barely 5 feet tall, he was a renegade Republican who had opposed many of the policies of Republican President Herbert Hoover. LaGuardia's district was East Harlem, a neighborhood of European immigrants.
LaGuardia was very eager to promote bills and to introduce bills that would improve labor conditions, that would improve housing, that would improve economic conditions. And I think that was characteristic of him all through his life.
But in March of 1933, the homeless and the poor lost an advocate in Congress. Defeated in the Democratic landslide, LaGuardia returned to a New York where victims of the Depression camped in cardboard shanties. LaGuardia swore he would give up politics, but few believed he would stay on the sidelines if Roosevelt's New Deal could help the city of New York.
History turns a page. President and Mrs. Hoover, leaving the White House after 4 trying years, greet Mrs. Roosevelt on the portico. The President-elect awaits them in the car in which he and Mr. Hoover will ride to the Capitol together. The retiring President and the new, the man who bore the burdens and the man who now assumes them. An historical moment in the life of the nation is approaching.
I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis. Broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
The energy that was let loose right after that inauguration was enormous. Washington had never known anything like it. Stylistically, there was just this abundance of movement and activity and a sense of let's get on with the problem.
And you felt that this guy came, he was going to save the people. And a tremendous feeling for him. Holy hell, the people that could kiss his toenails. That's how much they loved this guy.
I think he was primarily a person who was convinced that there was poverty in the country, need in the country, and he wanted to do something to help. New York had declared a bank holiday for the banks in New York, but Roosevelt followed it up with a bank holiday for the national government and throughout the country.
By early 1933, Americans were lining up to withdraw their money from a banking system on the brink of collapse. Roosevelt closed the banks for 4 days and pushed through an emergency banking bill authorizing $2 billion in new money to help pay off depositors. The new president went on radio with the first of his fireside chats.
I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days, why it was done, and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington,
he made listeners feel as though he were talking to them and to them individually and alone. And this was a remarkable technique that he had.
Roosevelt would caress with his voice the microphone. And he treated the people as though they had intelligence.
Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
I remember in those days, if you went through any area during the fireside chats, you could hear them walking down the street. You didn't have to worry about getting home in order to hear it, because it would be turned on all the way home.
We would ourselves sit down and talk over what he had said, and then we would look at what was happening all around about us, but still come out feeling good about it, feeling better than we had felt, though we had problems.
We were a serious country. The people had something to do with the government, and they felt in Roosevelt they had somebody who understood them, somebody who spoke to them. Other politicians found him mendacious and tricky, which indeed he was, but he was also had a direct pipeline to the people.
When the banks reopened, deposits exceeded withdrawals. Roosevelt had restored confidence, not only in the banks, but in the possibility of recovery. In the first 100 days of the New Deal, Roosevelt and Congress created 10 new agencies to combat the effects of the Depression. The alphabet soup of New Deal programs had immediate impact on the lives of millions of Americans. The first jobs program, the Civilian Conservation Corps, put 250,000 young men to work restoring the nation's forests. Roosevelt preferred a system of work relief to giving out welfare checks. But the president decided he had to push for direct federal relief, or millions would starve.
This was a absolutely new program for the federal government to be engaged in, that is, to be handing out relief. It wasn't much handed out on any level, and suddenly for it to be a major program with millions of dollars involved, with people getting money for nothing, as it was said by the opposition to it.
President Roosevelt has given me the job of administering the $500 million appropriated by Congress under the Emergency Relief Act of 1933. to help care for the 18 million persons whom the Depression has plunged from self-support to public dependency.
In his first 2 hours on the job, Harry Hopkins dispensed $5 million in relief funds.
I came to work for the FERA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, in September of 1933. We were a group of young people. For most of us, this was our first job. And we were terribly wrapped up in what we were doing, very excited about it, felt that the future of the world depended upon us.
So there was never any difference between work in the office and being away from the office. When we went to eat or to restaurants or go even taking our wives dancing that hot fall up on the roof of the Powhatan Hotel, very few people danced. They talked the whole time. We were talking about our jobs.
Eleanor Roosevelt would get literally thousands of letters a day, and poor Harry Hopkins would get the brunt of them, with my grandmother writing on the top in hand, "Harry, can't we do something about this person?"
With the government programs underway, Roosevelt turned his attention to the private sector.
Blue Eagle's loyal legions on parade. Soldier and sailor, millionaire and office boy, society maintenance shop girl, elbow to elbow in the NRA Army. 250,000 economic warriors forming the greatest peacetime demonstration in American history.
In September 1933, the government sponsored a spectacular parade up New York's Fifth Avenue to promote an unprecedented federal effort, the National Recovery Administration. Roosevelt called the NRA a partnership in planning between government and industry. Its goal, to speed recovery by establishing profit levels for business and wage levels for labor. In a show of national solidarity, more than 2 million employers across the country promised to abide by the NRA codes.
The NRA means to me a steady job with more pay. The extra kind comes in handy. I got a new job and it's great to be working again.
Thanks to President Roosevelt's plan, the NRA, which has made it possible for me to resume my position as a mannequin.
I am 100% in back of President Roosevelt's Recovery Act, and I want every one of my customers to know it.
The NRA also supported the right of employees to form unions and bargain collectively. Garment workers in New York City used the NRA to win higher wages and better working conditions.
It was almost enough for a president of this great nation to take account of us foreigners, which is what all of the union members were, practically without any exception, and acknowledge that things are bad and that workers are permitted to organize.
We must say that the NRA improved our needle industry. We are able now to make a living better than any time before. We work in short hours and getting better pay. Long live President Roosevelt.
Not everyone applauded Roosevelt's New Deal. Senator Thomas Gore, a Democrat from Oklahoma, was an outspoken opponent.
My grandfather felt that any kind of government regulation was wrong. One of the things that he disliked about Roosevelt was not only the centralizing of all power, but this vast bureaucracy. He kept all those acronyms. He kept setting up NRA and this and that. Unlike Hoover, Roosevelt would try anything.
When bringing New Deal programs into New York, Roosevelt worried about working with the Democratic political machine that ran the city, Tammany Hall. In 1932, as governor of New York, he had backed attempts to force Tammany Mayor Jimmy Walker out of office.
Walker was probably the most charming man who's ever held public office. And he's also a brilliant man. He could do more in 5 minutes than most mayors could do in 5 weeks, and he did it. But he was also completely amoral and corrupt.
Tammany Hall was in charge of the city, and the city had become so accustomed to corruption that it was hopeless to try and get anything done without paying in some way or in some form for what you got. Bus franchises, for example, were given out to people who paid large sums of money to city officials.
If anybody was hated in New York City at that time, it was Tammany Hall. You know, Tammany Hall, if you had a grocery store, the cop would come in and take this. If you had a peddler's store, you take an apple. You go into a restaurant, they'd eat for nothing. Arrogant, arrogant, arrogant.
Corruption had stopped the building of the Triborough Bridge. With an initial $50 million price tag, it would bring jobs and economic development to a city desperately in need of both. But Tammany politicians squandered the first $5 million and could not raise the rest. The Triborough became the bridge to nowhere. Judge Samuel Seabury spearheaded an effort to probe graft in New York.
The Seabury investigations got started because of corruption in the magistrates' courts, and they led from there on into a legislative investigation of the whole city government. And Walker resented it, and finally, he was brought up on charges.
Hello, everybody. That's all I can say now, with a lot of other good stuff to follow.
And he resigned.
From the Bronx and happy Harlem to the windswept Battery, we fight for New York's honor and the Fusion victory.
The Fusion Party, a movement of reformers, anti-Tammany Democrats and Republicans, turned to former Congressman Fiorello LaGuardia as their candidate for mayor.
When the 1933 election came along, Walker intended to run for re-election to fill the vacancy his resignation had caused, and then the Roman Catholic Cardinals stepped in, and they withdrew Walker as a nominee and nominated John P. O'Brien, who was the exact opposite of Walker. O'Brien had 9 kids and a wife he was loyal to. Walker had 9 mistresses. Walker was brilliant, O'Brien was slow.
LaGuardia, he topped it off because LaGuardia came in and said, "I get you guy, you Tammany Hall politician. You're not going to be the Ward Hill. You're not going to run this city. We're going to run the city. The people are going to run the city."
We intend, after January 1st, to reorganize the city government. We intend to have a general house cleaning. Yes, we'll not only clean the streets of this city, but I'm going to clean every department of every grafting Tammany politician and appoint honest men and women in their places.
Well, LaGuardia was a very earthy campaigner. He came into a group, and he was part of the group in a few minutes. And if it was a Jewish group, he spoke Yiddish. And if it was an Italian group, of course, he spoke Italian.
You got LaGuardia in front of a group of Hungarians, Fiorello would address them in Hungarian. You see, he had been an interpreter at Ellis Island early in his career, so that he knew all these languages and had no hesitancy at all in using them in the course of a campaign.
In the depths of the Depression, more than 2 million New Yorkers went to the polls. The New York Times reported it was the largest vote ever cast in a city election.
I believe Fusion will aid the unemployment situation of New York City, and I will vote for Major LaGuardia because he is fearless and independent.
As new mayor of the city of New York, Fiorello H. LaGuardia, elected chief executive of the world's greatest metropolis after one of the most intensive political campaigns in the city's history.
We have a job to do more important than fighting our political enemies. There are real enemies at our doors. They are hunger and squalor and misery and disease. They are unemployment and inefficiency and dishonesty and graft. They are waste and sorrow. These are our real enemies.
Right after election, he embarked on a vacation trip down to Panama. It was on that trip that we flew up the coast in 14-passenger Curtiss Condors, otherwise known as flying coffins, and gradually fought our way up to Washington.
It was agreed that we would undertake a very large work program called the Civil Works Administration. That was a program that employed 4 million people.
They had to start a whole new system of getting checks out in order to pay a program that was putting 4 million people to work.
Morris. Monica.
As a matter of fact, you know, they ran out of both the check ink, the check paper, because the people hadn't been paid by federal checks except a few 100,000 in Washington.
My name is Mr. Raymond Shipp, blacksmith for trade. Received first check today. Since August 10th, 1932, my wife and 3 children will certainly be proud to see me ride home with this.
LaGuardia secured 1 out of every 5 civil works jobs for New York, but critics charged discrimination in hiring.
Some of the first opportunities were coming through these new programs. But at the same time, what would often happen would be that a call would go out even for something like cleaning up the parks or snow removal or some of those kinds of assignments, and black people would go, but they were not employed.
There were always people within those programs who operated them in accordance with their own personal feelings, and some of those personal feelings included the belief that Negroes weren't entitled to as much as anybody else.
In other hiring areas, LaGuardia did make a difference. He opened up jobs to Italians and Jews who had been shut out by Tammany. And he shook up city government with a campaign to end corruption.
LaGuardia came in with a pledge to produce an honest day's work out of every city employee, and he made a good stab at it. Of course, there's just so far down the ranks you can go, but at the top levels. And he had nationwide contacts, so he was able to bring in bright and imaginative people.
LaGuardia swore in Robert Moses as City Parks Commissioner. Moses insisted that he also be given control of the Triborough Bridge Authority. LaGuardia agreed. In Moses, he had found someone who shared his dream of rebuilding the city.
And Moses, of course, always wanted his own way on everything, and he was always threatening to resign. And one time he came into LaGuardia's office, unless I do this, I'm quitting, I'm getting out of here. I can't stand this interference anymore. And LaGuardia handed him a printed pad of slips saying, I, Robert Moses, do hereby resign as blank, effective blank. Moses took the pile of slips, threw it on the floor, walked out, and of course didn't resign.
We are spending $400 million for public roads in every state in the Union. This is an allocation out of the sum of $3,300,000,000
that is being expended or will be expended for public works.
Headed by Interior Secretary Harold Ickes, the Public Works Administration promoted itself as the greatest single construction program in the history of the world. For LaGuardia and Robert Moses, PWA meant jobs for the unemployed and the building of roads, bridges, playgrounds, and public housing. Projects that would begin to change the face of New York.
LaGuardia actually got more money from the Public Works Administration than any other city in the country because they did have a way of getting specific plans that the government was able to see and undertake and finance.
How much will this new project of yours cost, Fiorello? Well, Harold, this particular one, eliminating land, I would say about $15 million.
I think he was a pain to some, and he was a pleasure to others. If they wanted the project, then he was really a pleasure to be whole. If they didn't want the project, he was so insistent and persistent that they were very happy if something would cause an emergency which would require his leaving, because he didn't give up easily.
But LaGuardia's plans soon ran into trouble. The mayor did not know that Robert Moses had been feuding with Franklin Roosevelt for almost 10 years. Moses had called Roosevelt, who was disabled by polio, a poor excuse for a man. And he had ridiculed Eleanor Roosevelt's appearance and voice. On direct orders from the president, Ickes demanded that Moses be fired. LaGuardia was stunned. Of all the people in New York, he said, I had to pick the one man who Roosevelt won't stand for.
And I forget who it was, probably Harry Hopkins, said, you know, Mr. President, aren't you being a little bit vindictive about Robert Moses? After all, he's just Parks Commissioner in New York, and you're President of the United States. And Roosevelt said, cannot the President of the United States have at least one petty, malicious, vindictive response to someone?
Moses refused to resign. For almost a year, LaGuardia stalled, and the federal money kept coming. Finally, Roosevelt had had enough. At the president's direction, Ickes cut off all funds for New York, including the Triborough Bridge. Federal money would soon run out and cost the city tens of thousands of jobs. In Harlem, the need for those jobs was critical. The unemployment rate had reached 50%.
Here was a whole community where I remember someone saying once where $1 was $1, and black people didn't have any.
The community's shopping area was 125th Street. The stores there sold everything from furniture to groceries, practically everything. But the stores there were all owned by whites, and they also, their staff, sales staff, and the whole visible staff was all white.
The pattern of segregation in New York was as rigid as the pattern of segregation in any part of the Deep South.
As the Depression wore on, the black community increased demands on local store owners to hire Harlem residents.
Why should all the white people come in here, get those jobs, and then go home and take the money out of Harlem? This gave rise to a slogan, don't buy where you can't work.
The Don't Buy Where You Can't Work campaign drew participants from church, civic, and black nationalist groups. A young minister, Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., managed for a time to unify the movement.
My father's nickname was Flaming Tongue, and he had heard that people in City Hall and LaGuardia administration were very wary of this minister up in Harlem, that he could arouse people. There was a great deal of mistrust by the LaGuardia people. What is Powell up to? And there was certainly mistrust on the part of my father. Why isn't City Hall dealing with this?
I had a little assignment, which was to go to a record shop with another girl. And we were to go in the record shop and say to the owner that we felt that he should hire blacks since we bought records. And it was at that moment, and I can almost feel it now, when he took to me and he said, "Why don't you go up to Spears? That's a furniture store up the street, because you can't take that furniture, but you people will steal all my records." Well, I came alive at that moment. And I tell you, he put something into me. We rushed back to Adam Howe. We told him what had happened. And he said, "Well, you're absolutely right." So they added more pickets to us. And we went back and really helped to put that man out of business.
Some merchants gave in to the demands. Others went to court. In October 1934, the picketing was ruled illegal. The hard-fought triumphs of the campaign quickly evaporated. Harlem's mistrust of City Hall continued to grow. That fall, 1 in every 7 families in New York City depended on relief. 1,200 new applications were processed daily.
We're 8 in a family and got a couple of pounds of macaroni, and we ate macaroni, and we ate macaroni. And we had 1 meatball. We had to divide it up. We really went around hungry. We had headaches from not eating.
Money received from Washington and from the state capitol in Albany was not enough. LaGuardia was forced to levy new city taxes.
Every cent from this tax goes for direct relief, food, clothing, rent, fuel for the unemployed of this city. The payers of this tax are contributors to a worthy cause. The dodgers and those who advocate dodging this tax are just cruel, selfish bread snatchers.
It was very exciting to be part of the new reform administration. For one thing, LaGuardia was an exciting person to work with. And for another thing, the things which he espoused and which he was doing and which he wanted were things that I felt were very much to the benefit of the community.
I think I can say that though our non-political, non-partisan government is still experimental, that experiment is working out. Among other things, the city is now caring for a total of 300,000 families on home and work relief. The present monthly cost is $17,750,000, including federal and state contributions. No city in the world in so brief a period of time has had to face a comparable problem. It has been met.
While LaGuardia sang the praises of his administration in New York, in Washington, the New Deal administration was drawing heavy fire.
The Treasury statement of December 15th shows that since Mr. Roosevelt became president, our national debt has increased over $2,900,000,000.
The New Deal is government from above. It is based on the proposition that the people cannot manage their own affairs and that a government bureaucracy must manage for them. We do not want to see these alphabetical bureaucratic agencies become permanent fixtures in our national political life.
New Deal is on. Get up, get up, get out, get into it.
Despite aggressive promotion of Roosevelt's plan to achieve recovery, the NRA was now under attack from all quarters.
Up and yelling it. They're spelling it. NRA.
The NRA was blamed for driving up prices and driving down production, and for favoring big business.
I've been in the tire business for the last 10 years, and with the NRA, I'm worse off now than I've ever been.
The codes under NRA have had a tendency to build larger, the large companies operating in their fields, and have worked a terrible hardship upon the smaller competitors and upon the American consumer.
The NRA got also to be called the Negro Runaround. And that's what we found we had, that no matter how hard we worked, we came up with the least good job and with the least good pay.
In 1935, a poultry company in Brooklyn, New York, challenged NRA codes regulating hours and wages in their business. The Schechter brothers took their case all the way to the Supreme Court.
Unconstitutional. The Blue Eagle cries no more. Nearly 800 codes directed from Washington are suspended. The parked cars of thousands of NRA workers soon may be going away for good. The Supreme Court has spoken.
I've got the blues. I've got them NRA blues. Lord, I got them NRA blues.
When he took office, Roosevelt had said to the nation, "Together we cannot fail." But the NRA had failed. After 2 years of New Deal programs and billions spent, the Great Depression continued. Aboard the presidential train, Roosevelt met secretly with LaGuardia. The president was under attack for using public funds to carry out a personal vendetta against Robert Moses. Roosevelt agreed to end the feud. Within days, Washington released money for completion of the Triborough Bridge.
Oh, you make good when you make a promise. No, I'm not a doubting Thomas. But, honey, are you making any money? That's all I want to know.
Here's this huge project. They're going to build the bridge to connect Harlem to Long Island and the Bronx. Huge project. People thought this would be a great boon to Harlem. Supply of jobs, money flowing into the community, and then to turn around and discover that the people running the Triborough Bridge project had no intention of hiring black workers. This a bridge which, on the Manhattan end of it, ended at 125th Street, right in the heart of Harlem.
There was discrimination in some of the PWA projects. There was some discrimination probably in all of them. The unions had a union shop, which meant that they would supply the labor and that they would restrict the employment to the members of the union. Many of the unions discriminated against blacks.
The disillusionment when that money didn't seem to find its way into the pockets of the people who needed it in Harlem was severe. And my father talked to LaGuardia and warned about difficulty of conditions, the frustrations, and how really the conditions were right for a major problem in Harlem to suddenly erupt.
Harlem's experience with the police added to the frustration. For years, residents had complained of police brutality. Most charges went unanswered. or were dismissed. In the spring of 1935, tensions in the community came to a head.
There were rumors, and that's the way such things begin, that a black boy had been mistreated by the police, and then there was another that a woman had been hit. But before anyone knew it, thousands of people were in the streets, and there was this great upheaval and a real riot up and down the street.
In, I think it was Woolworths or Chris, one of those department stores, a kid whose name was Lino Rivera. They said that he had been caught stealing from the counter, and the manager and a couple of people had taken him down in the basement and beaten him to death. The crowd believed this, and they were mad. As I got to the corner of 7th Avenue and 125th Street, the crowd started surging up, breaking windows. There were just a few policemen, and they were trying to keep out of sight because this crowd was really on the rampage.
There was a Chinese laundry. And when he realized that it was the black people moving in, destroying all the stores and properties owned by the white people, trying to get them out of Harlem, he went out and put a sign in his window and said, "Me colored too."
That riot started around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it began to peter out around 3 a.m. But along around 2 a.m., I got a call from Jesse Battle down at the 28th Precinct, which was 123rd Street. He said they had found the boy.
I picked up a knife and put it in my pocket. The floor walker caught me. He put the knife back in its place, and then he started shoving me out the store. So I told him, all right, well, don't push me anymore. And he says to the other fellow, come on, let's take him down the cellar and beat the heck out of him. So after that, the police officers came, they took my name, and then they sent me home. At 2 a.m., they called for me again, and I didn't know anything of a riot or anything, but they thought that I was dead.
I have always felt that that riot was due to happen. Lino merely happened to be the trigger. But if he hadn't been there, we'd have had to invent something. There was going to be a riot because that was the temper of the community.
My father's word to LaGuardia was, I told you, this was coming. You've got to address this. You've got to come up here and do something about this. The money and the programs designed to combat the poverty of the Depression simply had not filtered through into Harlem to help the people.
The riot marked the beginning of LaGuardia's real attention to Harlem and its problems. Within a year, he appointed the first black magistrate in the city's history and pressed forward with public works projects to benefit black residents.
Excavation is begun for Harlem's first low-rental housing development. These new Harlem homes, when finished, will help ease the housing crisis in one of the worst New York slums.
Also, in the wake of the riot, the mayor formed a commission to study conditions in Harlem. The report was highly critical of the police and the prejudice that touched almost every city department. LaGuardia was not prepared to place Harlem at the top of his agenda, but he did commit more resources and personal energy to the black community.
He'd have a dinner party up at Gracie Mansion, and the audience would be stacked, all integrationists, except for one department store owner who hadn't done the integration. And the conversations at dinner table somehow would lead around to this, and everybody would talk up in favor of the need and what they had been doing and whatnot. And this poor Patsy was the only one out of 20, and he left there convinced that he had to do something about integration.
he would give out a call and he would say that you have to go into this community, take on people. He insisted that people be employed. And he did not talk against discrimination, but he would say, we've got to get more blacks, we have to get more people of different races, and so on.
And so you had the beginnings of opening up of City Hall, first to this mayor who was elected, who was himself Italian and Jewish, and then, by the end of the decade, opening reluctantly or otherwise to somewhat more influence by the black community.
In New York, the mayor could prod and cajole, but the power to create more sweeping social and economic changes lay in Washington. After 2 years of emergency measures, Roosevelt created the Works Progress Administration, and by presidential order forbade the agency to discriminate on any grounds. By 1936, New York City was receiving 1/7 of the WPA budget for the entire nation. Roosevelt said about LaGuardia, "He comes to Washington and tells me a sad story. The tears run down his cheeks, and the first thing I know, he has wangled another $50 million out of me."
And we shall continue on our onward march of progress to make this a better and a happier city.
The mayor and Robert Moses continued to modernize New York. The West Side Highway would make it possible to drive non-stop from one end of Manhattan to the other. LaGuardia Airport would become the busiest in the world, handling 200 flights a day. Schools, parks, 10,000 new public housing units, all part of a massive building campaign, made New York a leader in the new federal partnership with America's cities. On July 11th, 1936, with Mayor LaGuardia and Robert Moses in attendance, President Roosevelt dedicated the bridge that had brought pain and now pride to New York City.
Another vast project takes its place among the nation's monuments to progress. The Triborough Bridge, $60,300,000 highway link, awaits its dedication by President Roosevelt.
Yes, people require and people are demanding up-to-date government in place of antiquated government, just as they're requiring and demanding Triborough bridges in the place of the ancient ferries. Government itself cannot close its eyes to the pollution of waters, to the erosion of soil, to the slashing of forests, any more than it can close its eyes to the need for slum clearance and schools and bridges. May the Triborough Bridge, in the years to come, justify our efforts and our hopes by truly serving the city, the state, and the nation.
The things that he did said to us, no matter who says that feeding the hungry or giving clothing or helping those who need housing to get housing, no matter who says that creates dependence, that the government has to take a hand.
He saved capitalism. Whether this is a good thing or not, I'm not about to betray my sentiments, but he saved it. It could very well have gone under, and those who said he's a traitor to his class didn't realize he was their savior.
But remember, the people at that time were called downtrodden. They had no lead, they had no hope. So you had two new guys come into the picture, Roosevelt and LaGuardia. And they stayed with America for a long, long time. The image of Roosevelt and the image of LaGuardia.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Fiorello H. LaGuardia. Their partnership changed the face of New York and expanded the role of American government. A half-century later, the physical changes endure. The responsibilities of government are still debated.